Prepping for a D&D session does not have to be a long and laborious process, and if it is becoming a source of stress, you might be doing it wrong. In this video, I want to talk to you about how I prep sessions, and more importantly, I want to give you 3 key principles that I've used over the last couple of years to really streamline and improve my prepping process, and turn it from something which is stressful and sometimes unrewarding to something which is quite efficient and conserves my time and energy and gives me more energy for the game that I want to play later on. Now, I like to have about 2 or 3 hours to prep a D&D session. Obviously, if I have longer, that's great. If I'm compressed into just 10 minutes of prep, I can do that as well. But almost regardless of the amount of time I have, those 3 core principles that I'm about to share will stay roughly the same and will guide the process throughout. Now, before I jump into the principles, I just want to quickly say a big thank you to my patrons. They're funding everything I do on this channel and everything that I do on my Patreon, where I do adventures and encounters, weekly and monthly content. We just released a big piece called Heroes of the Highlands, which is all about Scottish Dungeons and Dragons. If you're interested in that, head over, check it out. But if you just want to enjoy the videos, that's also greatly appreciated. A like, a share, a comment, all that stuff is phenomenal. Anyway, let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons prep. Principle 1 is very simple but very effective. Talk to your players about what they want and expect out of the next session. If you're a new dungeon master, it can be quite easy to fall into the trap of trying to anticipate all the different things your players might do next week or next session, and then preparing content for every one of those possibilities. Now, that's a lot of work, and a lot of that work will go to waste when all those possibilities collapse into the narrow and often unexpected outcomes that the players cause in the game. Save your time and energy for what matters, and ask your players in advance what they expect to do in the upcoming session. This is best done at the end of the previous session, or maybe in a group chat message in the week preceding the session you're prepping. Find out if there are particular locations that they intend to visit. Find out if there are particular items they're hoping to buy in the next town they pass through. The main reason you're doing this, primarily, is to limit how much you actually have to prep. If you know roughly the area that they're going to be spending most of the session in, you can anticipate what they'll find in that area, and you don't have to worry about them suddenly leaving and going elsewhere. That does occasionally happen. It's happened to me quite recently, but as a rule, if your players say, yeah, next session we want to go to that town and find that dwarf we've been looking for, they're probably going to try to do that. The other cool thing about asking your players in advance is that they'll bring up stuff that you've maybe kind of forgotten about or you're not expecting at all. That gives you a little heads up about what's to come. For example, let's say that a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned just in passing through the mouth of a random NPC the players met that in this upcoming town there's a tavern called the Berth and Barnacle, and in the Berth and Barnacle there's a really great ale that is famous for being very strong. Now, this was just a throwaway line you did in the process of a fun interaction with an NPC who loves a drink. But then you're coming up to the town and you say to your players, oh, by the way, what are you expecting to achieve and do next session? And one of your players says, well, I'm very excited to go to the Berth and Barnacle. I want to try this very strong ale. Now, you've completely forgotten about that tavern. You have no idea it's coming up, and you may not have prepped anything for it. But now you know the players are expecting to go to this town, and one of them is expecting to find the Berth and Barnacle, and they're expecting there to be something there prepped for them, because after all, you as the DM mentioned it and they've remembered it. Now you know that, and you can prep something, and it will complete that sort of immersive experience for the player without you having to be a mind reader. Now, going back to a more broad vision of what that session prep will look like, let's say I talk to my players and they say, when we get to this next town, we're looking for this dwarven NPC because he has this item we need to pick up, and then we're going to go and try to find a ship that will take us downriver to the next big quest location. Now that I know that, I can roughly assess how long that's going to take and how much content I actually need to prep for the town. They're probably going to spend a bit of time in the docklands trying to find a ship, so I'll work out some interesting little encounters, perhaps some fun NPCs they might run into in the docklands, a pickpocket or a street corner magician, I don't know, just something to make it feel like I've planned something, and that it's a living, breathing space when the players walk into it for the first time. I'm going to prep perhaps a little quest for earning passage on a ship. Maybe there's a captain who'll take them on, but only if they round up his drunken crew members. So they have to go around all the different taverns in town and find a different crew member. That's actually a really good idea. I'm going to do that. That's popped into my head fully formed. I might actually make that. I'm doing this Patreon piece about pirates in a few months, so I'm going to try to work that in there. Nice. Anyway, so yeah, you just make some stuff up, knowing roughly in advance what the players are going to do, and then because perhaps the players have, as we said with the tavern, the name of which I've already forgotten, the Berth and Barnacle, I think it was. The Berth and Barnacle, let's say. I now know that one of the players is excited about that, and I'll put a little bit of prep into prepping that as well. But again, we're collapsing all the potential possibilities into what the players are actually expecting, and as a result, we're having a better time as DMs, they're getting a more fully realised experience as players. Our second principle is prepare to improvise, and to explain this one I want to go into the example of the Berth and Barnacle, this tavern we're making up here. To clarify, when I say prepare to improvise, what I'm trying to get across is the fact that preparation isn't a way to avoid improvisation. It's a way to set yourself up so that when you inevitably have to improvise, you have a better time doing it. To explain this, I'm going to have to draw back the veil, pull back the curtain on one of the big sort of trade secrets of dungeon mastering. So, if you're a player, now is your time to leave. The rest of this video, we're getting into the, we're spoiling the magic. Okay, they're gone. If you're a relatively new dungeon master, the important thing to understand is that more experienced dungeon masters are not doing tons of prep. The prep they are doing is really just to facilitate good improvisation, because good improvisation is really the key to having a great time as a dungeon master and to being able to adapt to what the players do. Let's look at this example of the Berth and Barnacle, this tavern that I now have to come up with because my players are apparently excited to go there next session. Now, firstly, I'm going to tell you what I would have done when I was starting out as a DM. Now, as young DM Inspo, the first thing I would do, having realised that my players want to go to this tavern, is to prep every possible event that might happen at that tavern. I would think about my players and I would think, well, you know, our barbarian might go in and the first thing he's going to do is try to have a drinking game with someone. He's perhaps going to get a bit confrontational with some of the regulars at this tavern. So I need to create a colourful cast of different NPCs that our barbarian can go up to and engage with. I need to work out what happens if the barbarian starts a fight with one. Who will join the fight? Who will run for the guard? Oh, the guard might come. The city guard might be there. Now I need to work out the entire kind of system of the local guard and what they'll do if they show up after. This is too much. Especially when you think you're going to have to do that for every single player. What could every single player do in this situation and what are the consequences of that? You're going to end up spending so much time doing all this stuff, and then your players are going to turn around and say, you know, actually, we're a bit short on time, let's not go to the tavern. And all of that work is for nothing. So, that's what young DM Inspo would have done. Here's what I would do now. This is the work smarter, not harder approach. The first thing I'm going to do is try to think of something that makes the Berth and Barnacle stand out in the player's mind as being a different tavern from all the other taverns they've visited so far. I just need one distinct feature. So we'll say the distinct feature is that in the centre of the tavern there is a mummified pirate captain, his body encrusted with barnacles. This is maybe an old mummified corpse that was dragged out of the waves. There's still, dry dead crabs clinging to his scraggly skeletal face that's kind of popping through the mummified skin. So we get this kind of vivid description of a semi-mummified drowned pirate captain standing up, looming over the common room. And that's not something that's appeared in any previous taverns, and so for my players walking in there, they're going to say, this is a different tavern from all the other ones we've been to. Now, they might not pick up on the fact that everything else I tell them about the tavern, there's a hearth over there, there's some tables in the corner, there's some rooms upstairs. That's every fantasy tavern they'll ever go into. But what they remember about this one is the one key feature. Now, I can come up with a one key feature on the spot, I can do it in advance, in a minute, and now we have something that's going to make it feel distinct. Next, am I going to create an entire room full of NPCs? No. I just need one NPC, which is the one the players are definitely going to interact with. That's the bartender. Like the tavern itself, the bartender is going to be quite similar to a lot of other bartenders and NPCs the players have encountered, except for a couple of key features which will stick in the player's mind. We need a physical description, some kind of physical feature that looks a little bit different from other NPCs. We need, ideally, a distinctive accent, although that is not an essential element, but, you know, it helps. And we need to know roughly what the temperament of this NPC is. He also needs a name, but I can pull a name out of the hat if I really need to on the night. You know, Gazborg, boom, we've got a sort of half-orc-y kind of name there, so we'll say he's a half-orc. Okay, so we've got Gazborg the half-orc. We'll give him a confusingly plummy English accent. This kind of like something that just doesn't feel quite what the players expect, and that would just throw them off a little bit. They'll go, oh, that's kind of weird, I wonder what his backstory is, and they'll probably ask about the backstory. I'll make it up on the spot. I'm not going to prep that. Physical feature, we'll say that he has a big coiling scar around his arm. This is from a squid attack. Maybe a squid came into the harbour once, attacked a ship, he jumped in and fought this thing off and got this scar. So I was like, oh, he's a bit of a local hero now. This is all kind of just coming out of a couple of random features. Again, he's starting to stand out in the player's mind. Finally, his temperament. Well, just from doing that kind of silly accent, I'm thinking he's probably quite a big, boisterous, plummy, outgoing individual, someone who is quite happy to see new players walk into his tavern. You know, someone who's just quite affable and amenable, a big kind of bear of a guy. And now we're getting a kind of a clear idea of who he is and who he's going to be for the players. Now, the temperament is important because that's going to help me decide on the spot how he responds to things. I don't need to decide in advance how he responds to the players starting a fight, but I just need to know that he is quite a forgiving, pleasant guy, and so when the players do start a fight, his goal is probably going to be to de-escalate it. But we also know that he's a pretty big, physically imposing guy. He fought a squid, so he's probably going to go in, get physically into the fray, but try to calm down all the combatants. He's not going to call the guard and get things messy. He just wants everyone to be friends in his tavern. So we've got a whole character here. The players are never going to dig that deep, and if they do, I'll fill in the blanks in the spot. The important thing is that now this tavern with its weird mummified kind of captain mascot and its friendly, slightly kind of it's interesting tavern keeper, it's all going to stand out in their mind, and they're going to think that I prepped this way back during that first interaction where an NPC mentioned this tavern. In reality, I'm making all this up kind of on the spot right now talking to you guys. So this is not like a deep prep process, it's more just me kind of pulling stuff out of the air. I'll write it down in a Google Doc and print it out on the night. Now, do I need to prep all of the NPCs who are going to be in the tavern when the players go in? No. I know they're probably going to talk to the bartender when they go up to order a drink, but I will bring in NPCs as the players go looking for NPCs. If one of my players goes looking for a fight, there's a big Goliath in the corner who's spoiling for a fight as well, and I'll make up some stats on the spot. You know, it's going to be maybe a little bit of a fist fight. It's not going to be high stakes. Again, I don't need to think about that in advance. We fill in the blanks on the night. The thing is, I'm going to feel so much more confident improvising because we do have a rough framework here. We have a clearly defined NPC in the Tavern Keeper. We have a slightly distinctive tavern. We have a name. We have a reason for the players to show up. We know that there's going to be a strong ale on draft. And so anything else I make up on top of that, it's not going to feel too flimsy because it's nested within this relatively robust framework that, at least in the player's mind, is going to feel like it was always meant to be there. As Dungeon Masters, we don't prep because we want to avoid improv. We prep so our improv is better and easier for us and more immersive for our players. Now, as we move towards the third and final principle, the question that's coming up in my mind is, why are we doing this? Why are we trying to slim down our prep process? Why are we trying to save this time? Is it just so we don't have to do any prep at all and we can, well, partly, you don't want to do loads of prep, and I think perhaps doing too much prep can actually have a negative impact, but we are going to do something with all the time we're saving from not prepping towns and villages and roleplay settings. We're going to put all that extra time and energy into combat. The third principle, and the one that kind of brings all this together, is improvise your roleplay and prep your combat. Now, this is very subjective. This is just what works for me. It might not work for you, but I'm going to speak from my own experience here. For me, prepping for the roleplay sections, prepping for the towns and villages and the NPCs, that stuff, it has diminishing returns. Once you've done the basic kind of laying the groundwork, as we talked about in the first two principles, we don't really get a lot of benefit from adding additional detail to our prep. And in fact, it can actually make us worse at improvisation if we're not very fluid and flexible. When the players start surprising us, we're trying to stick to our carefully planned, prepared vision of the game. We end up being worse at improv because we've over-prepped. One place that, in my opinion, the more prep the better, is combat, and I'm going to try to explain why. If I have 2 hours to prep a session, I'll probably spend about 30 minutes prepping the roleplay sections and maybe an hour and a half prepping the combat. And for me, that usually works out pretty well, because combat will kind of suffer if you've not prepped. If you don't know your monsters particularly well, they're not going to be very fun and effective in battle. If you've not prepped and kind of planned the flow of the battle, things can end up feeling very low energy and repetitive. When you plan a battle, you get to think about the experience the players are going to have, and you can kind of anticipate what they'll do because you've got a map in front of you, you know what's going to happen on that map. Now, the players, as you know, will go into that fight and they will try to probably defeat all the enemies and achieve any clear objectives on the map, like, you know, defeat the enemies and save a prisoner who's in a cage hanging above a pit of sharks. But the key thing here is that you can kind of anticipate what they're going to do, and so you can actually plan to give them a really effective, interesting combat experience. The first pillar, if you like, of D&D combat prep, in my opinion, is understanding the monsters, understanding the enemies you're throwing against your players. I've often had combat encounters, especially early on in my time as a DM, where the combat didn't really feel that good. The monster maybe just soaked up a lot of damage, didn't do that much, and then died. And in retrospect, 9 times out of 10, it was because I wasn't using the monster effectively, because I didn't really understand the monster's full capabilities. Afterwards, I would go back and look at the stats and say, oh, it had a cool ability it could have used there. It had advantage on that check that ended up bringing it down and knocking it prone. And there are so many little elements where if I'd really understood the monster, I could have given my players a more challenging, dynamic experience. Players want interesting enemies. They want enemies who, halfway through the battle, reveal that they have some cool reaction or bonus action they've not used up until now. I mean, that's why legendary actions are so cool for dragons and other high CR monsters. The second pillar of D&D combat prep, I guess we're doing this pillar thing now, that's fine. The second pillar would be understanding what the monster's strategies are in advance. Now, if you just throw monsters onto a map, you can do your best and you can have them run in and attack the players and try to deal some damage before they go down. If you've properly prepped it, you can plan strategies for the different monsters to play out on the battlefield. That's very effective if you have a couple of different antagonists who can start working together. A well-planned goblin attack can actually be super effective even on a slightly higher level party. If they're all working together to spring traps, to hold one player down while the others pepper them with arrows, that kind of stuff gets really interesting for the players because it becomes problems to solve. One of my favourite recent battles was just the players trying to get from one side of the map to the other so they could enter a castle. If I've done this right, the map should be appearing behind me right now. And as they tried to battle across the map, there were various defensive positions, palisades and ditches that had been dug. And hobgoblins were defending these positions. Now, hobgoblins aren't super high CR, and my players were definitely way overpowered to be challenged by a gang of goblins. But these goblins, I'd planned all the strategy in advance, and they really worked together to make it a really challenging process for my players to move from A to B across the map, because they were always having to try to find cover, trying to find ways to deflect arrows or sneak around. There was a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, and that was because I'd prepped it in advance. Remember, smart enemies are fun and challenging for your players, and 9 times out of 10, smart enemies are the result of prep. The third pillar of combat prep, I feel like there should be 4 pillars, but there are 3 points I'm trying to make here, so it's 3 pillars. The 3 pillars of D&D combat prep. The third pillar is the map itself. Now, I put a lot of effort into prepping maps, and you don't have to do all this. I use a site called Incarnate. Very good. Highly recommend. Not sponsored, but Incarnate, hit me up. You know where to find me. I use Incarnate to make these quite detailed maps I can then either share to my players if we're playing online, or I put it on a TV screen that I lay flat on the table if we're playing in person. And it's you know, it's an immersive experience because they can see little details in the map that I probably wouldn't be able to add if I was doing it all by hand, or even if I was using the sort of limited terrain pieces I have access to. Now, the reason I do this is partly because I find map making fun, but also because it gives me a chance to give the players a very dynamic experience in battle. If you just have a big square open space, and let's say we're doing that hobgoblin battle I talked about earlier, the players are trying to get across the map. If it's just a big flat open space, the tanks will run into the front and basically kind of stay there. The ranged attackers and the spell casters, they're all going to stand at the back or maybe get onto slight elevations and stay there. And everyone's just going to kind of fight out the battle from these starting positions. If you throw a lot of stuff on the map, trenches, old pieces of ruins, perhaps little chests scattered around that extra items can be found in, just stuff that breaks up the terrain and motivates players to go to different parts of the map, they're going to have a much more engaging, interesting experience. There's going to be a lot more room for strategy for both your players and the people that they're fighting, and it's a better experience 9 times out of 10. Now obviously if you're a theatre of the mind person, that's totally cool, you do you, but I'm just saying that's from my experience where a lot of my prep time goes, and I'm able to do that because I actually spend so little time prepping all the roleplay stuff. So in summary, if you're a new DM, or if you're a DM just looking for some inspiration on how to go about prep, the principles that have helped me the most are, firstly, ask your players, talk to your players in advance, find out what they actually want from the next session, and then you'll have a bit of a forewarned is forearmed situation. Principle 2 is prepare so that your improvisation, which will inevitably happen, is even better. And finally, take this time you've saved as a result of those first 2 principles and put it into creating really fun, dynamic combat encounters. Anyway, that's the video. I'm not very good at outros, but I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've got something useful out of it. Huge thank you to my patrons as always, and to everyone who is on this channel, subscribing, watching, liking, commenting, engaging. It means a lot. I really appreciate it. I'm also happy to say that long form videos like this are now going to be my primary format on the channel, and I actually have a video coming out next week, so we're going to get this regular video thing rolling. And the reason I have to commit to getting it out next week is I have a sponsor, which is very exciting. It's not NordVPN yet, but that's the white whale. But yeah, I'm really excited to be able to work with a cool sponsor who's another D&D creator whose project I get to talk about, and that will be in next week's video. But my hope is to start focusing on weekly long form videos instead of doing the short form videos. I love the short form videos, and they've got me a long way to where I am at the moment, but the amount of effort it takes to do these short videos, to edit them together and put them out, I could almost just do a long form video in that time. And I think in the long run, I have so much fun doing these long form videos, and I think I can convey more information, useful information in the long format. So we'll see how this goes. We'll see if my views tank horribly or if we can keep getting growth with the longer videos. And anyway, thank you for sticking with the channel, and I'll see you soon.